The room went completely silent when the 70-year-old millionaire looked across the crowded charity luncheon and jokingly said, "If I were younger, I'd ask you out." He expected laughter. Instead, the woman standing beside his table smiled through tears and answered, "Who said no?" Nobody laughed after that. Because behind those 6 words was a love story neither of them had ever dared to tell. If you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so our community can keep sharing stories that remind us that sometimes the heart gets its chance long after life says it is too late. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, a 64-year-old woman who had learned how to make herself invisible in rooms where everyone else seemed important. She worked 3 mornings a week at the Hartwell Community Center, organizing donations, preparing meals for struggling families, and quietly repairing whatever needed repairing. She never asked for praise. She had spent most of her life believing that the kindest things were the things nobody noticed. She had silver-streaked auburn hair she wore neatly at her shoulders, thoughtful gray-blue eyes, and the calm expression of someone who had survived enough heartbreak to understand that not every wound needed to be displayed. Across from her that afternoon sat Everett Callahan, a 70-year-old self-made millionaire whose name appeared on buildings, scholarships, and charitable foundations throughout the city. To strangers, Everett seemed untouchable. He wore expensive suits, arrived in polished cars, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent decades making decisions while other people waited for them. But the people who knew him well understood that wealth had never cured his loneliness. His wife, Marianne, had died 8 years earlier after a long illness, and although Everett had never remarried, he had never truly allowed himself to grieve either. He had buried himself in business, convinced that staying busy was the same thing as moving forward. Eleanor and Everett had known each other for nearly 30 years, although neither had ever called their relationship a friendship. Their paths had crossed through charity work, school fundraisers, community projects, and countless ordinary afternoons. Whenever Everett visited the community center, Eleanor was usually there. She knew how he took his coffee, remembered his birthday without being reminded, and noticed when he was pretending to be cheerful. Everett knew she always carried peppermints in her purse and that she hummed quietly whenever she was nervous. They had shared thousands of small moments, but somehow the years had passed without either one asking the question that mattered. There had once been a chance. 30 years earlier, Eleanor had been a young widow raising her daughter, Clara, alone. She had been working 2 jobs and barely keeping her little apartment warm during winter. Everett had been a rising businessman struggling to keep his company alive after a disastrous investment. They had met while volunteering at a food drive, and something between them had quietly begun. Not a romance. Not yet. Just a warmth neither could explain. Everett had wanted to ask her out. But he had seen how exhausted she was, how much responsibility she carried, and he convinced himself that the last thing she needed was another complicated relationship. Eleanor, meanwhile, had noticed the way he looked at her and had quietly hoped he might ask. But she believed a man as ambitious as Everett would eventually choose someone younger, wealthier, and easier to love. So they waited. And waiting became years. Years became decades. Then came the luncheon. Everett had attended to announce a new scholarship program for single parents. Eleanor had spent the morning arranging donated flowers on the tables, checking the seating cards, and making sure elderly guests had everything they needed. When Everett watched her laugh with a group of volunteers, he realized something that frightened him. For all the money he had made, all the houses he had purchased, all the companies he had built, the happiest moments of his life had almost always involved that woman. He walked over to her table after the speeches. Eleanor had just finished pouring coffee for an elderly guest when Everett sat down beside her. They talked about ordinary things. The weather. The scholarship. The community center. Her daughter. His grandchildren. And then Everett looked at her with a mischievous smile and made the joke that changed everything. "If I were younger, I'd ask you out." The people around them smiled awkwardly, expecting Eleanor to laugh. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes. Who said no? The question struck Everett harder than any business failure ever had. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Eleanor smiled, but her eyes had filled with tears. She wasn't flirting. She was telling him the truth she had carried for 30 years. Everett finally understood. She had been waiting too. But the discovery did not immediately bring happiness. It brought regret. They began talking privately after that day, and each conversation uncovered another piece of the life they might have shared. Eleanor admitted that there had been countless times when she almost called him. Everett confessed that he had written her a letter 30 years earlier but never sent it because he thought she deserved a man who could give her more stability than he could at the time. Eleanor laughed sadly when she heard that. She told him she had never needed his money. She had needed his courage. Those words stayed with Everett. For the first time in his life, his fortune seemed almost embarrassing. He had spent decades believing that providing everything meant giving someone what they needed. But Eleanor showed him that sometimes the most valuable thing a person can offer is simply the courage to say, "I choose you." Yet just as they began to grow closer, an old wound returned. Everett's son, Graham, discovered that his father was spending time with Eleanor. Graham was a successful attorney who had spent years protecting the family fortune. He was not cruel, but he was suspicious. He worried that Eleanor wanted access to his father's wealth. When he confronted Everett, he said things that hurt more than he realized. He reminded his father that Eleanor had struggled financially for years and suggested that perhaps she had waited until Everett was old and wealthy because she knew what he could provide. Everett was furious. But instead of defending Eleanor, he became uncertain. That uncertainty reached Eleanor through a conversation she never should have overheard. She was in Everett's study delivering documents when she heard Graham questioning his father about her intentions. She heard Everett hesitate before answering. That hesitation broke her heart. She left before either man knew she had been there. For the next several weeks, Eleanor avoided Everett. She returned his calls politely but never personally. She stopped attending the charity board meetings when she knew he would be present. She convinced herself that the past had been romantic because it had never been tested by reality. Everett was devastated. Then came the unexpected turning point. Graham discovered an old box of his father's belongings while helping organize the family archives. Inside was the unopened letter Everett had written Eleanor 30 years earlier. He read it. And suddenly he understood how wrong he had been. The letter wasn't about Eleanor's money. It wasn't about loneliness. It was about love. Everett had written that Eleanor was the first woman who made him want to become a better man rather than simply a richer one. He had written that he admired the way she raised Clara, the way she helped strangers, and the way she never treated people differently because of their bank accounts. He had written that if circumstances were different, he would have asked her to build a life with him. Graham sat alone with the letter for a long time. Then he went to find Eleanor. He didn't arrive with money, flowers, or excuses. He arrived with humility. He apologized. He told her that he had judged her without knowing her, and worse, he had planted doubt in his father's heart. Eleanor listened quietly. She didn't immediately forgive him. She told him forgiveness wasn't something she could give just because someone asked. Graham nodded. He said he understood. Then he told her something she hadn't expected. His father had stopped going to the office every morning. He had stopped attending business dinners. He had stopped pretending that wealth mattered more than people. For the first time in decades, Everett Callahan was choosing his life instead of managing it. Eleanor went to see him that afternoon. She found him sitting alone in the community garden behind the center, wearing a simple sweater instead of his usual tailored suit. He looked older than she remembered, but somehow more peaceful. He didn't try to defend himself. He simply told her that he had spent 30 years being afraid of losing something he never possessed. Her forgiveness came slowly. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because she finally believed his regret was real. They did not pretend they were young. They didn't need to. They began walking together. Slowly. Carefully. Honestly. Their relationship wasn't filled with dramatic promises. It was built from ordinary things. Shared lunches. Grocery shopping. Morning walks through the community garden. Helping at the center. Visiting Clara and her family. Sitting together in silence when words weren't necessary. Everett discovered that happiness didn't feel like the excitement of youth. It felt like peace. And Eleanor discovered that starting over didn't require forgetting the past. It required refusing to let the past make every future decision. Months later, Everett stood in the same community center where he had made his careless joke. This time, the room was filled with volunteers, families, children, and friends. The scholarship program had expanded, and Eleanor had become its director. Everett walked to the front of the room and looked at her. He smiled. Then he said that he had once joked about being too old to ask Eleanor out. He admitted that he had been wrong. Age had never been the thing standing between them. Fear had. The room filled with applause. Eleanor walked toward him, took his hand, and smiled through tears. They never called their story a late romance. They called it a second chance. And perhaps that was what made it beautiful. Because sometimes life doesn't give us the person we love when we think we are ready. Sometimes it takes years of mistakes, loss, fear, and growth before two people finally become brave enough to recognize what was standing in front of them all along. Everett had spent his life building a fortune because he was afraid of having nothing. Eleanor had spent hers giving everything away because she knew possessions could never replace love. In the end, neither needed the other's money. They needed each other's courage. And the millionaire who once believed he was too old to fall in love learned the most valuable lesson of his life: the heart does not keep a calendar. It only asks whether you are brave enough to open the door when love finally knocks. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Before you go, leave a meaningful comment and tell us this: do you believe it is ever too late for a second chance at love, forgiveness, or happiness? Because sometimes the greatest love story isn't the one that begins when we're young. Sometimes it's the one that finally begins when we're brave enough to say yes.